One of the things that I saw was that ultimately you could tell the story of the future. This is the future we need, and everyone bought it. But you tell the story of transition and transformation, and they're like, this is really hard and messy. You have to go from A to B while A is still running. The details of sustainability, the details of transforming our real world are extremely technical. They rely on data and science from a lot of different sources. And so the question then is, how do you take all that specialist knowledge and bring it into one place so that a financial generalist can make a financial decision?
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking with innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. How do you solve a problem, especially when it's a problem that no one has solved before? There's a wealth of research and strategies around problem solving and how we do it. Abstraction, reduction, A3 method, the 8 disciplines, OODA loops, root cause analysis, even the good old scientific method. It can be really interesting to compare and contrast these types of approaches, to learn how other people think, and also to optimize your own ability to take on complex challenges. There's a reason this kind of stuff is a mainstay of some of the most popular business books out there. In some ways, figuring out how to figure out problems is the very essence of what defines a successful business. But I think there's a possibility that all these systems and terminology actually obscure a more important and fundamental process in how we solve problems: trial and error. It's the first way most of us learn how to do anything: walking, talking, riding a bike. We try, we fail, we try again a bit differently, fail again, keep trying new ways until we succeed. Maybe for the very reason that it's so basic to us, there's a tendency to look down on trial and error as rudimentary, inelegant, or a brute force approach to problem solving. But I think there's something beautiful about trial and error that speaks not so much to human ingenuity, but to perseverance and our enduring optimism in the face of challenges. What's the old Edison line? I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. So if there's any merit at all to viewing trial and error as a lesser approach to problem solving, it's only when talking about completely randomized trial and error. And it's not that it's invalid for finding a solution, only that it can be problematically time-consuming in the absence of any constraints. Actually, nearly all problem-solving methodologies, like the ones listed before, are really just methods for narrowing down the number of potential solutions to be tried by trial and error. Think about the scientific method. You define a question, gather existing information, form a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, analyze the data, and form conclusions, which either give you the answer or lead you to a new hypothesis. The first few steps, defining the question and studying existing information, help formulate more targeted hypotheses, so you aren't testing at random, but the basic feedback loop is still just trial and error. Other methodologies continue narrowing possible solutions in more elaborate ways, but the bottom line is, no matter how much we refine our potential solutions, there's actually no way to be 100% certain of their effectiveness until we've actually tried them. The bigger issue, then, is not whether trial and error is effective, or even whether it's efficient, but whether it's practical. As businesses scale, any kind of big change becomes expensive, and therefore a little more risky, especially changes that involve major equipment or physical infrastructure. The kind of changes, incidentally, that many businesses are facing in the transition to a new low-carbon, clean energy future. Many of these technologies are new, and in some cases, we don't fully know the best practices for implementation, even if we do recognize their potential for impact, both financially and for sustainability. We need to trial and error our way to their optimal usage. But getting a big project like installing EV chargers or a low-carbon HVAC system wrong could be financially fatal for an individual business. This disincentivizes change, and yet, change is needed. So, what if there was a way to see exactly what would happen to your bottom line and carbon footprint if you installed those EV chargers where you think you should, without having to actually physically build them? What if there were a way to test every permutation of your sustainability plan to see how all the options interact with one another, and to do it virtually so that you can freely experiment without substantial risk? Even better, what if you could do all those simulations in a user-friendly interface that gives non-specialist executives the chance to visualize the plan and compare the results of different approaches? This is the extremely cool premise of Actual, a software startup building a sustainability transformation platform that allows users to maximize the impact and ROI of their capital plans, while reducing real-world risk by enabling virtual trial and error. Imagine if you could plug your business into a computer game and try out new strategies free from real-world constraints. What amazing ideas would you discover? I think it's a really intriguing concept for a product, and so I'm super excited to have Actual co-founder and president Karthik Balakrishnan on the show today to tell us about it. Karthik is a rocket scientist. Like literally, he has a PhD from Stanford in aeronautic and astronautic engineering. He began his career interning for NASA at the Goddard Space Flight Center and Ames Research Center. He spent several years developing the Altiscope air traffic control project that was later incorporated into Airbus as Airbus UTM. And in classic Silicon Valley fashion, he got his entrepreneurship bug while at Stanford, taking a break from his PhD to go co-found Coin, a successful fintech startup that was eventually bought by Fitbit. He's an angel investor, a writer and speaker on sustainability transformation, and a genuinely really interesting guy to talk to. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Thanks for joining me today. How's it going?
It's good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's start at the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Originally from the San Francisco Bay Area. Family moved out to Maryland right before I went to high school. So I went to a bit of middle school and high school out there. So I got to see kind of both coasts, but missed California. So came back for college, did undergrad, grad school, all out here and have stayed here in the San Francisco Bay Area ever since.
And you had kind of pursued aerospace engineering kind of straight through your academic career. I'm curious, how did you know that's what you wanted to do? Because it's such a unique and obviously challenging specialty to get started in.
Yeah, it's funny. I've liked planes since I was a little kid. I think it's one of the things that, a lot of people like. For me, my family was originally from India, right? So going to the airport and getting on a plane was how you went and got to see the rest of your family and all your cousins and grandparents and stuff. So I think from a very early age, planes for me were a good part of that connection to family and everybody else. And then from there, then you're like, oh, well, planes generally are cool. And then kind of one thing led to another. And I actually got a chance to work in a bunch of different parts of aerospace and aviation, working on spacecrafts and launch vehicles and UAVs and aircraft and kind of the systems around them in grad school, using satellites to do physics experiments in space. And so got a really broad exposure to, actually aerospace engineering is more than just planes. A lot of the fundamental kind of science and engineering that goes into making the aerospace industry work is kind of the same science and engineering that goes into making a lot of the rest of things work. So kind of got sucked in just because of childhood interest, and then started to realize actually aerospace engineering gives you a really broad foundation for solving really any kind of physical engineering problem, because you require assembling things from so many different disciplines to make these things work.
And you ended up for grad school staying on the West Coast and going to Stanford. Was grad school always part of the plan? Was that like a natural continuation?
No, coming out of undergrad, I was both applying to jobs and grad schools just to kind of get a sense for what is it that I wanted to do. I really wasn't sure at that point. But one of the things I realized is that when you're an undergrad, you kind of learn about how to take the tools that exist and apply them to solving a problem. And I started to wonder, well, not only where do these tools come from, but how do you build new tools?
Sure.
And for me, going and doing a PhD especially was a way to learn about that, right? So how do you go from, okay, here's a tool, here's a hammer, here's a saw, whatever, and this is how you make things with the tool, versus in order to solve tomorrow's problems, today's tools don't necessarily cut it. You need new tools, new techniques, new approaches. And for me, what I started to realize is that for the jobs I was interviewing for and applying to, the ones that were really interesting were the ones where it was about, here's a problem that you can't just Google, right? That's the result of someone having done it before, published about it, and you taking the thing and assembling it new. The problems that were really interesting to me were the problems that no one solved it before. People have solved pieces of it, but no one's assembled it. But there's a key piece that hasn't been done before. And so for me, that really tipped the scales towards grad school of okay, here is an opportunity to learn how to not just solve a problem with the tools that exist, but look at a problem and figure out what tools need to exist to be able to solve that broadly.
Yeah. Why Stanford? I mean, it's obviously an incredible reputation, an incredible institution, but I'm curious kind of about your experience there specifically and the department and how, give us a flavor of that.
Yeah, so Stanford Aeroastro, so aerospace engineering just depends on when the department started. In some schools, it's called aerospace engineering because they started basically Apollo era or after, when space was part of it.
Yeah.
The older departments, they started as aeronautics because no one was going to space, and then they tacked on astronautics afterwards. So Stanford, has a reputation in the aerospace industry because they were one of the original departments, and they're called aeronautics and astronautics. But for me, a big part of going there was the breadth of research that was being done, that going there didn't limit you necessarily on day zero to working on one thing or another, because that was the thing the department was good at. They have folks
Sure.
working on a huge array of things. And so for me, that was like, okay, I can spend the first couple of years getting a really broad exposure to things before diving into a particular specialty. For me, that was control systems working on spacecraft, but there were people doing control systems underground, underwater. There were people working on new kinds of thrusters, on fluid mechanics, all these kind of things. There's so much going on that you could jump in and learn and then say, you know what, I want to work on that thing, as opposed to, for a lot of schools, they're so focused that you know that when you go there, you're going to work on X without necessarily having tried it and done it and being like, well, am I good at this? And do I like it? And, if you find something you like, but you're bad at, it's probably not going to turn out so well. And so having that opportunity to find a place that you like and that you're good at.
Yeah. You talk about the energy around people focusing in various things and the dynamics of that. I'm curious, within that department, is there the kind of overarching Stanford energy and momentum towards entrepreneurship, towards startups? I mean, we certainly know it exists, at the business school and in the clean tech program. There's a lot of folks where, it's down the road from Sand Hill Road. It's got the ethos of startup land. Did you experience that as well when you were there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one of the other things that attracted me to Stanford. A lot of the professors became professors via doing a startup, building something new, and then coming back into academia of other professors who are actively taking the research and commercializing it. I think the other thing that's really unique about Stanford is a focus on interdisciplinary work. So the lab that I ended up joining was actually not in the aerospace department. It was called the Hansen Experimental Physics Labs. And in that group, you had people from aerospace engineering, mechanical engineering, physics, materials science, biology, chemistry, all coming together to solve problems that don't fit neatly into a box.
Sure.
We had aerospace engineers like myself working on building instruments. We had physicists working on interpreting the data from those instruments. It was this concept of bringing a bunch of folks together to solve a real world problem. And so, there's both a focus on entrepreneurship in the sense that my PI folks in the lab, they're all involved with commercial industry as well, but also with startups and taking, okay, here's a thing we've discovered in the lab. How do we turn that into something that benefits more than just a publication that comes out? Publications are important, but that's not the end goal of doing this research. The end goal is to have an impact on the world. The other piece of that, of course, is also recognizing and for myself, realizing that it's very hard for a single disciplinary team to solve a problem.
Yeah.
An aerospace problem is a physics problem, is a material science problem. A climate problem is not just a climate problem. That whole review for me came out of this very visceral understanding and experience of, here's a problem that needs people who have a lot of different backgrounds to solve.
Yeah.
You can't do it alone.
You mentioned Stanford. You were excited about it because of that entrepreneurial spirit, because it was imbued through professors and through peers. Was that something that you had always known about yourself? You'd always had this desire to build something on your own or go out there and start a thing? Or did you figure that out in the process of being in school or grad school?
I think in the process of, I really wanted to have an impact and do stuff in the real world, but it was, not necessarily I have to go start something, right? I mean, coming out of undergrad, the option was not start a company or go to grad school. I was applying to jobs or looking at grad school, right? Yeah. So it was very much wait a minute, I now know how to figure out the solutions to solve a problem. So why don't I go solve the problem, right? I think it's that mind shift. And I think that's where you see so many more startups coming out of schools like Stanford and Berkeley as well, right? Our cross-Bay rivals, but there's a real sense of, if you can arm people with the tools and the knowledge to build tools and put them into an environment where they are solving problems, they're going to want to solve problems. And I think that Stanford and a lot of schools like Stanford have done a pretty good job of fostering that mentality.
Was there a specific class or course or professor or assignment where the switch kind of flipped on you?
Actually, I think it was in doing my research. We were building spacecraft to test Einstein's theory of general relativity, and we were basically working on one small instrument of that. But what was really interesting is we were relying on some real cutting edge technologies to make that work. And a lot of that technology was stuff that we couldn't have built in the lab ourselves because they were the result of years and years of R&D. And so there was about 50% of the system was things that we were assembling and 50% of the stuff were things that we were designing. But when I was talking to people providing those components, they were pretty much all startups at the cutting edge, right? Yeah. The only way this research was possible was because someone had gone and said, here's a problem, let me go take this cutting edge thing and commercialize it. So it was a very practical recognition, realization that if you see a solution, you have to make it. You can't just wish that thing existed in the world.
Right.
If you know how to build it and you don't build it, it's not going to be there.
You mentioned this when you were talking about Stanford, and it's something that resonates because I've heard a lot of folks that we've talked to, a lot of founders, talk about the importance to them of being a bit of a generalist or having a bit of a generalist mentality. I'm curious how you think about that, both in engineering, having the ability to see and understand the types of problems that need to get solved widely, but then also pulling back a little bit, how you think about that as a founder, as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think the generalist mindset is extremely important for a couple of reasons. The biggest one is, again, no problem gets solved in a single discipline. And you just don't have the resources as a founder on day zero. There's a few founders who can go out and say they're going to raise several $1 trillion. But aside from a few folks, generally you start with zero. And if you're starting with zero, you need to be able to assess the opportunity, the likelihood, the technology, the roadmap, all those kind of things yourself or with a couple of people.
Yeah.
And what that means is understanding beyond your own particular domain of training what it's going to take to succeed. So I think having a generalist mindset is super critical for that. I think it is very important, though, not just to be a generalist, but to have at least one, but preferably a couple of areas of specialization, because you have to understand the hard work that it takes to go from, I read a textbook and I know about something, to like, I've discovered something in this space. Sketching out the idea, you have to be a generalist. But it takes something from, I've proven the n=1 case, to taking it to a machine that can take it to the n=100 case. That requires specialists. And you both have to have a respect for the specialist, right? You have to understand what it took for them to get good at that one thing. But you also have to have an understanding of what can you hold them to deliver? Even if you're pushing them, what is a reasonable set of outcomes versus not pushing hard enough or pushing too hard, right? There's always going to be that balance. And the only way to set that is to be able to jump into that domain and say, I know enough about it to roughly understand what to do. If you're starting a company, you have to be able to do that. There's also external factors, right? Policies change, regulations change, the economics change. I'm not an economist by training, but I have to understand the impact of interest rate hikes on infrastructure investment, because that's going to impact the customers that we're talking to. Who is more likely to buy? Who is less likely to buy? How do I prioritize sales and R&D? That's going to flow down to a product. So, my co-founder or CTO has to be able to understand that so that he can make decisions about which product features are more relevant. Is it more about risk or return? And how do we think about that? So being able to understand that whole system is really critical, even if, I'm never going to go get a job at the Fed.
Right. So from school, you've continued to have an interesting career path. I know 2012, with 1 year left of your PhD, you take a leave to go take your first dip into entrepreneurialism. And I wanted to hear that story. Tell us a little bit about the Fintech startup Coin and that journey.
Yeah. So this is super interesting for me. When I took leave of absence, my professor was like, you're probably not coming back. And I was like, just watch. And I actually did go back and I finished up because I was so close to finishing. But yeah, Coin was interesting. A friend of mine had a fintech background. I'm not the fintech expert, but he started asking me questions around electronics. And again, speaking of interdisciplinary, my degree is in aerospace engineering, but I'd say about half the work that I did was in basically electrical engineering, material science. And so in the evenings after coming back from the lab, we'd sit down at his dining table and sketch some schematics, and then I'd go and wrap the PCB and do the electronics. And I realized, well, okay, I can actually take this from just giving some advice to someone who wants to start an electronics company to actually going and figuring out how to build this thing.
Yeah.
And so basically for me, it was initially a kind of a slow, almost electronics advisory kind of thing into becoming co-founder and CTO. I think the really interesting thing about Coin was it was one of those electronics products that we had to invent a lot. And we had to push the boundaries of what was possible in manufacturing, because we were basically packing a whole computer with Bluetooth, battery, button, screen, all that stuff into, credit card by regulation is less than 0.8 millimeters thick because it has to fit into an ATM. Like there's a size that it has to be. Most of these consumer electronics companies are not used to building things that are this thin. So we had to go and build circuit boards. We had to buy wafers and grind them. And we had to work all the way back to the fundamental level. And so I realized, it was funny. A lot of the stuff that I was doing in grad school, learning about in grad school, how do you build the tools to do the thing, we had to do as well. We had to actually work with suppliers that are at the top of their field and help them invent new tooling just to be able to make this thing happen. We got delayed as consumer electronics startups tend to be, but we ended up shipping north of 250,000 units. And that was a real experience for me of seeing how you go from, wouldn't it be a cool idea if, to solving the R&D problem, solving the manufacturing problem. We had a great team behind us. We brought in manufacturing experts, supply chain experts. And that's the thing about generalist to specialist, recognizing, hey, we need an expert who's mass manufactured things before. We need an expert who's negotiated supply contracts before, who knows how to hold a supplier accountable. That for me was a really formative journey in terms of realizing like, okay, it is possible to take an idea from idea to mass production and delivery. And what's really quite funny is every few months, someone will randomly post on X or Twitter that, hey, I found this thing and it still turns on, right? 10 years after we shipped, these things still turn on, which now we're thinking, well, maybe we over-designed it a little bit and we could have saved some money with smaller batteries and what have you. But, there's an element as well of like, okay, these things were built to last. And we actually did solve the R&D problems we set out to solve.
And your first exit. You had this experience and then you're back to aerospace.
Yeah, it was interesting. So first thing I did is I called my PI and I was like, hey, I'm going to come back and finish. And he's like, that hasn't happened before, but okay, come back. So went back to Stanford and I wrapped up the PhD, defended. And I thought to myself, I just did a PhD in aerospace engineering. I should do something in the aerospace world. And Airbus had just started a program here in the Bay Area called A-Cubed. It's still running today, really focusing on figuring out what the future of aviation is going to look like and building the core technologies and the core business cases behind those technologies, essentially to transform the fundamental business of Airbus. What was really interesting about that is they were basically looking to bring in people kind of like myself who had backgrounds in aerospace engineering and aviation in those related technologies, but also with startup experience. And so for me, this was, okay, I've seen what it takes to build something brand new at a startup when you have no resources.
Yeah.
What does it look like building something new when you have the backing and the brand name of a company like Airbus? And what was really interesting, right? Airbus has been trying to figure this out. How do you walk the line between innovation and reliability and safety, right? When you get into an airplane, you want to make sure that it stays together. And Airbus has done a good job of that. But part of that is you end up in a bit of a conservative mindset around safety and reliability and things like that. How do you, in the company where that mindset is very important and critical to the safety, foster a culture of innovation? How do you bridge that gap? And you don't want to get to that culture of innovation and let your safety standards slip.
Right.
That's not good. So the question is, how do you innovate in a culture of safety? So that was a really interesting experience for me because aviation, again, very highly regulated space, Airbus, very safety-oriented, performance-oriented culture. How do you think about innovation in these hard to innovate in domains? So I started a program there that's now called Airbus UTM. It was called Altascope when I started it. But essentially figuring out how do we think about the future of air traffic control? Air traffic control today, it's a very manual process, started in the 1950s. It's people talking to each other, figuring things out. And obviously there are challenges when you get to the limits that we have today, right? And today only 20% of people in the world have been on an airplane. So you think about countries that are developing economies, what do we think the airspace is going to look like 50 years from now when 5 times as many people are going to be on airplanes? Obviously, we're going to build high-speed rail and things like that, but there's going to be a flip side of a lot more demand for aviation. Our current system is at the limits. And then as soon as you start thinking about things like delivery drones and autonomous cargo jets and all this stuff, the whole system has to look different. So Airbus for me was an opportunity then to think about what does real world transformation look like? How do we take a built environment, a set of infrastructure that we have and transform it? What is that process, the mechanics? How do you make the case? And do it in a way where people are expecting the reliability and safety of the thing that already exists. Basically spent 2 years with Airbus, built the team, and then transitioned it out of the innovation group back over to the main company. Because at that point, it was very clear that we had built the foundation. And now it was at the stage of growth where it was really important to imbue the Airbus safety reliability culture into it as part of that next step. So that made a very natural point of, okay, we've done the Silicon Valley work, the 0 to 1. Now it's time to do the Airbus work of 1 to 100.
That was my follow-up question. And what was the lesson learned around how to navigate that dichotomy between the innovation and risk-seeking ethos of a startup, of entrepreneurship, and culture of where reliability, safety, security are the forefront?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the typical startup journey is try a bunch of stuff and see what works.
Right.
And when you apply that process directly with no edits to that safety reliability culture, that's where things break down.
Yeah.
Because there's no point trying something that works if it's unsafe. But you also don't learn the lessons from that. So what ends up happening is you have a bit more of an analytical upfront approach, which means, again, going back to your question about generalist versus specialist, that small team that's figuring things out has to be comprised of generalists who can do that safety reliability analysis, who can do like that triaging, but also instead of trying 50 million things and pivot until the thing sticks, have a bit more of a formulation of what is the actual problem we're solving? What is the root cause of that problem? And let's architect a solution that we're pretty sure works. That approach will work if you have the financial resources to do it.
Sure.
If you have $50,000 from an angel investor, that approach is going to fail. But if you have the backing of a company like Airbus, you can take that very analytical approach and say, we've done the studies of the 100 possible pathways, and these two are likely. And this one is safe. Yeah. So we're going to go all in on that one. So it's a very different mindset, but it still requires you to look at the 100 paths and very quickly iterate on those things, but in an even lighter way. So somehow the entrepreneurial mindset of those entities have to be more entrepreneurial than the small startups because they have to fail even faster because they can only push the good, valuable things to that next step.
Right. My father worked in aerospace forever, and it's so interesting to hear his commentary on some of the more innovative, more commercialized aerospace operations these days who are so willing to fail. You know, he was at a defense contractor for decades that is the anathema of everything that he believes is the right way to engineer, build, ship product. You know, every test rocket explosion to him is another indication of not of a lesson learned, which I think is what a lot of these more entrepreneurial endeavors frame it as, but as this is a risk, this is a safety hazard. Their approach is wrong. The methodology is wrong.
Yeah. What's really interesting for me, and this is actually one of the things that I started to realize was a general problem, is that culture we definitely saw during the first clean tech crash. And people point at Solyndra and they say, well, look at that failure. Solar is dead. Yeah. Well, clearly not. If you look at the cost of solar since 28, since that, it's dropped orders of magnitude. But the approach of energy in the old days, if you will, and energy today is, I think, very similar to your point about the old guard of aerospace versus the new guard. Like, yes, failure is fine, but we have to create a risk envelope where the failure doesn't hurt somebody, where we learn from failure as opposed to die by failure. Yeah,
yeah. One more kind of CV item that I'm excited to talk about before we get to the founding of Actual. You've also spent time as an angel investor and partner at Pioneer Fund. So I'm curious to hear about that experience a little bit. And I suspect that some of that came out of learnings from Coin, so that came out of learnings from work in aerospace engineering. But talk to us about Pioneer Fund and what you've learned as an investor in that space.
Yeah, so the investments that I've made have pretty much all been in areas where I feel like I know enough about the space to make a decision. And part of that is because for me, angel investing is less about a financial return and much more about like, this is an idea that needs to exist in the world. So let's see if we can make it exist.
Yeah.
Because at that stage, the risk is so high, right? The probability that the company fails is so high that like, you can't stake your retirement on it. Like you shouldn't. Right. It's really a way to say this founder is someone that I think is working on something really interesting. Let's give a little bit of juice in the very early stages to help them figure out what that pathway looks like. What's really interesting for me about that investing journey is when you're an entrepreneur and you're pitching and you get a bunch of no's, it can feel like a black box. Like, why do they say no? What's going on? On the other side, you try to say, well, wait a minute. I had a slide that looks exactly like that slide, but it didn't resonate for me. Why was that? Right. So it's also made me a better fundraiser. It's also given me a lot more empathy. I think there's this tendency for first-time founders to be like, what is the role that a VC has? It's just cash, whatever. But it's given a lot of empathy into what is going on in fund construction, portfolio construction. What is it like to go talk to LPs, things like that? What are you accountable for? What are you responsible for? And there's a sense of like, okay, you don't really have a lot of say in the outcome. You write the check, you sign the safe, you wire the money, and then you get the updates. And then, hey, I need help with X. Okay, I'll try and help you. Oh, that help worked. Great. I'm glad I could make the connection. But it's given a sense of empathy for what's on the other side. Who's on the other side, right? Like they're figuring things out too. The deal didn't work because they have parameters, right? Sometimes you can't negotiate someone into a position that they can't support. And having been on the other side, now I understand like there's hard parameters. And yes, certain things you can negotiate and certain things you can push, but you have to explore what those boundaries are. Yeah. So that for me has been real eye-opening.
I'm curious, when you talk about your framework, you invest in things you believe should exist in the world. Is that part of what you sold to LPs?
Yeah. So, I mean, my investments have basically been my own personal
Sure.
money. In the case of Pioneer Fund, a lot of that is, yeah, like here's a company who is building something that is solving a missing puzzle piece. So, like, here's a company that's focused on clean energy. And right now, everyone is working around it. But this is a bridge. Here's a puzzle piece that completes the map.
Sure.
Or in financial technology, the company that I invested in India that's operating a lot of rails now for the street side sellers that sell snacks and things from carts and helping them digitalize. Well, there's a couple missing pieces there that in their workflow, no street vendor in India is going to have a square terminal and turn around and ask for the tip
Right.
because they're so busy, they're doing a bunch of things. The entire interface needs to be different. The entire experience needs to be different. Here's a piece that needs to exist in that.
Do you think, I asked the question because I've had a couple interesting conversations, both with folks who have been out there as GPs raising, but then also a couple of folks that have been really successful in endeavors and exited and then have put their money in as LPs. But I'm curious if you have a sense for what the appetite is for certain kind of folks in the capital markets, in the private venture capital markets, to take the leap behind ideas, not behind returns. I certainly think there are some, because I've heard a few different funds say that that's been part of their sales pitch to LPs is like, we want LPs who are coming in, not just because they want a venture return, but because they want a venture sized impact. And I'm curious, like, if you hear that, if you see that, if that jives with kind of your reality.
We're seeing that at the largest scales today, right? I mean, so Apollo, Brookfield, Franklin Templeton, all these huge funds are announcing $10, $50 billion climate funds. And they're saying it's going to go into net zero decarbonization. They know there's going to be a return there, but they have this extreme focus because they are looking for a very specific outcome. There's this combination of it needs to exist in the world, but also it's a good business, right? And if they're successful, it can be a good business, right? I think that's the key piece there.
Sure.
And so I think there's definitely a message to LPs, and you see a lot of funds doing this as well, where should this exist in the world? And part of the should this exist is it solving a key bridge in a thing that you can actually make money with?
Yeah.
And if the answer is you can't make money with it, the answer might be, let's wait a year. Because if you think about maybe they're relying on batteries. Well, if you think about the cost curve for LFP batteries, there were cost estimates from the IEA for 2040. CATL announced end of last week that they're going to hit that mark by the end of 2024, right? 16 years early. So there's certain things where you say this needs to exist. And part of the messaging to the LPs is more that you cannot objectively say there's going to be a return because of the data today, but you need to believe that the cost curves of the things, that the market, et cetera, is going to shift in a way that by the time the company figures things out and is ready to go to market, there's going to be a very good financial case.
Sure.
And that's true for Actual as well, right?
I mean, that's the perfect segue. So let's start with the origin of Actual. Where did the idea come from?
So it's actually a combination of the backgrounds of myself and my two co-founders. So of course, my background, aviation, aerospace, consumer electronics. But one of the things that I saw working on Airbus UTM was that ultimately you could tell the story of the future. This is the future we need. And everyone bought it. But you tell the story of transition and transformation, and they're like, this is really hard and messy. And there's this interstitial state. And I can't just ground all of the airplanes for 5 years and spin up a new system. You have to go from A to B while A is still running.
Yeah.
And I realized, especially not just talking to the transport agencies, but the ministers above them, that this was a broader problem around the broader energy transition, which is, hey, I have a coal plant. My entire country runs on coal. And yes, I need to switch to something else. What does that transition look like? I have a fleet of diesel trucks and want to switch to electric or hydrogen trucks, but I don't have the relationships with utilities because I've never had to buy electricity in volume. I just have some warehouses that I turn the lights on and run some machines. Maybe it's hydrogen, but there's no hydrogen today. There's this big challenge around everyone understands the end state, right? FedEx, UPS, they know that if their fleet's going to be decarbonized in 2050, they know what it's going to look like.
Yep.
What does that transition look like? What does that transformation look like? And so I realized there was a huge gap there. So I actually got together with my co-founder, Rajesh and Derek. Rajesh was actually the first angel investor in Coin. So we've known each other now for north of almost 12, 13 years at this point. And then Derek was one of Rajesh's lead engineers at his previous company, Heighton. Rajesh's background, AI, machine learning. He's been starting AML companies since the early 2000s. But his background also is enterprise software. He was head of analytics at NetSuite. He's seen how do big companies use software in making decisions.
Yep.
And then our co-founder and CTO, Derek, PhD in cognitive psychology, Rhodes Scholar, really an expert in how do people think, how do people make decisions, how do people learn, How do people go from blank slate, I know nothing about something, to I can make a decision about something. I can learn about something. I'm an expert on something. And we realized really that one of the key building blocks that was missing was a way for these large organizations and their decision makers to learn about the pathway for transformation and get confident that their plan was the correct plan.
Sure.
And this is true at the government level, at the big enterprise level, the community level, what have you. We weren't exactly sure what the product had to look like. So we spent the first couple of years basically doing pro bono work. We're just like, let's not worry about trying to sign contracts because that always slows things down. Let's focus on just trying a bunch of things. Did some work in EV charging, in water, in medical facilities, and a bunch of different things. And we started to see a repeat thread, which is that the details of sustainability, the details of transforming our real world are extremely technical. They rely on data and science from a lot of different sources. But the people making those decisions, generally, they're very smart financially, but they're not the technical expert.
Sure.
And they will never be the technical expert because each of these domains is a specialty.
Yeah.
And you're an expert on water or on supply chain or on agriculture. But the CFO has to make a solution that satisfies all of these requirements. So the CFO is a generalist.
Yep.
And so the question then is, how do you take all that specialist knowledge and bring it into one place so that a financial generalist can make a financial decision? And we got there in part because of the unique background of myself and my two co-founders, right? I've seen kind of the objections to real world transformation. Rajesh has seen how enterprises make financial decisions. Derek knows how people learn. That combination of how do you teach leaders and enterprises to make transformation decisions, that's kind of a unique combination of the three of us.
So that gives us a good sense of the origin of everything. I'm curious how you would summarize the product, the service in an elevator pitch right now. Like how would you describe actual, in an elevator?
So think about us like SimCity. If you've played the game SimCity, which, is interesting because the folks who are CFOs and folks in that thing are now of kind of the age where they would have played SimCity growing up. So they get it. Well, what if SimCity was multiplayer and had real science behind it? So you could very quickly understand your capital plan and be confident that was correct.
Yeah.
Very visual, interactive, map-based interface where you see the real world, you see the projects, you see the investment options. And in the same way as SimCity, hey, I'm going to do a nuclear power plant versus solar. Why not do that with real science behind it? So very, very easy for someone to come in and toggle in our charging network. We're going to put L3 charge instead of L2 chargers. You're a utility and you're looking at a net zero neighborhood. Are we going to do geothermal versus heat pumps versus air source heat pumps? That's a very technically complex question that you can reduce to a slider so that the CFO can understand the implications of very technical decisions.
And I'm wondering, you're doing this pro bono work on these specialty fields. At what point do you have this realization, wait, the product itself needs to look and feel like a computer game?
I think that actually came very early on. We were working with a project here in California, and most of these big infrastructure projects, they have what's called a PPM, a private placement memorandum. Generally, you'll set up a project company, and the project company goes and raises money from large institutional investors, and they use that money to go build the thing. If you've seen these PPMs, and you can go to Google and type it in, and you'll see examples, they're hundreds of pages long, dozens of pages of legal boilerplate, all caps. And generally, they all look the same. And you don't know what the project is actually physically about until like page 50 or 60.
Right.
And even then, you don't really get it. That generates friction. And so one of the first things we did was we just made a quick sketch in a map and put it up on our site and showed it to one of these originators. And they're like, hey, I was playing with this thing last night and it actually made me more excited for my own project. Like here is somebody who has spent the last 10 years trying to build the relationships and work with cities and get the permits and all of these kind of things. They know the details. But seeing the thing on a map that was interactive, not in a PDF, not in a bunch of Excel files, they were like, I'm more excited to work today.
Yeah.
And then they showed it to one of the possible investors. And at that point, they were having a conversation about the details of investment within about 5 minutes because the investor knew what the project was about. Typically, you'd have a long pitch and then you'd leave the PPM and the investor would be busy and they wouldn't get around to reading the PPM. You'd follow up 5 times. And, like, who's going to read the 100-page thing? No one really. But in this case, they got into the details because you look at the map and you look at the real world and you're like, oh, you're doing X.
Yeah. It also harkens back to what we were talking about a little while ago around like a software solution to de-risk the innovation, to help the institutions that need safety, security, and reliability understand decision-making processes and the risks and the opportunities associated with them without necessarily being reckless and like, yeah, let's just go build the thing and we'll see what happens.
That's absolutely the case. And I think what's really interesting, this is a challenge a lot of large companies are facing right now, is that the map is constantly shifting.
Right.
For example, if you look at the cost projections for wind or hydrogen or batteries from the IEA, they're all wrong. And it's not because the people at the IEA are stupid. They're very smart people making these projections, but the innovations are happening in the lab. And so the cost curves are coming down faster than you predict. The regulations are changing, right? The EU is passing regulations around supplier transparency, around anti-greenwashing. We have the IRA, of course, that has completely changed the calculus and economics for things here in the US. When you have these multinational supply chains, all this stuff is constantly shifting. And these capital plans, if you're investing in a factory, that investment is a 15, 20-year thing, maybe more. Some of these investments are like, we're going to invest in something for 50 years.
It's generational, yeah.
It's generational, right? You don't just spend $1 billion and say next year we're tearing it down. That's the OpEx budget, right? Which is an order of magnitude smaller. The CapEx budget is long durational generational things. And so the risk is you're asking someone who is inherently very conservative, who's a CFO, to make a decision to buy something that is literally in a lab today. I want to buy 1 million units of something that works in a Petri dish only.
Right.
And that risk is huge. And so a big part of what we've found and what we're able to provide to the customer is, in this future state, if this thing existed, what would the impact be, right? So you see this a lot where people are like, oh, is carbon capture and sequestration really going to be a big thing? It's not proven. Well, let's test it out in your supply chain and see the performance that is necessary for it to be part of your plan.
Right.
And some people are going to say, you know what? We thought it's going to be part of our plan, but what we found is we don't believe the performance is going to be where it is to make sense. And other people say, you know what? It actually doesn't need to perform that much better than it does today to make a material impact on our footprint.
Yep.
So it should be part of our plan. Bringing the debate from a very dogmatic perspective to one that is, for your situation, is this going to work or not?
Yep.
That's really critical. And this is why you see shipping companies today, like they're replacing some of their trucks with cargo bikes.
Yeah.
Like you just put the guy on a bike and it's going to work because all the deliveries are in a 3-block radius and they're not going to get another parking ticket. Sign us up.
Yeah. I'm curious, you mentioned some of the real world variables that are changing. You mentioned the IRA. Like, how do you think that changes the equation for a lot of this investment?
So IRA is really interesting. A lot of fanfare when it first came out. It's taken some time for there to be the impact, right? Because it's a tax credit, fundamentally, right? It's a tax refund bill, which means you have to go do the thing and then go to the IRS and say, hey, I did this thing. And the IRS, they're not like scientifically technical, very smart folks there. But at the same time, they need to come up with guidance that says, what is the definition of green hydrogen, right?
Yep.
The IRA has a limit, it's like 50 grams per kilogram kind of a thing. They have a limit in terms of the carbon that can be attributed to the production of the hydrogen for it to be green. But there's a matching question, right? Is it hourly matching versus monthly matching versus annual matching? Can you buy a rec from that month and say that it counts or not?
Right.
So there's been a lot of guidance across the entire IRA that the IRS has had to come up with to say, this is what counts, this is what doesn't count. And that's taken some time. That's normal for it to take time. But now that the guidance is clear, you're starting to see a lot of the funds being released. We're starting to see a lot of companies that we've talked to for the last couple of years who are like, okay, we want to do something. Suddenly saying, we're going to do the sustainable thing. Why? Well, they care about sustainability personally, but also the fundamental outcome for them is financial.
Yep.
And the returns go up because the sustainable thing is cheaper now.
Yeah.
What's really, really interesting is that once they start exploring and that switch flips in their head of it's not a green premium, it's a green discount.
Yep.
They start to say, well, the IRA doesn't cover X, Y, and Z, but let's model that too. And wait a minute, there's no incentives in the IRA for Z, but it's also return generating. So let's do that too.
Yep.
So there's a direct impact of the IRA of like, we're going to give money and so, these things are cheaper. There's the indirect thing, which is that people are now thinking about doing that transformation. And at that point, once you're already doing the studies, It's not that much harder to build in another thing and be like, well, what if we transformed that? It's a little push.
That's fascinating. Curious kind of how you and the leadership team, each with very different backgrounds, how you found kind of the public communications. Like, what are the misconceptions that folks have when you're out there pitching, when you're out there fundraising? What are people saying or thinking about? I suspect on the sales side, it's super easy, given the value proposition is incredible. But beyond the sales conversations, the external communications realm, how is that? What are the kinds of conversations you're having?
So I think there's a couple of things. I think that there's a lot of folks who are looking at sustainability broadly, or interested in software and sustainability, but kind of stop at the measurement, right? There's a lot of activity around carbon accounting, carbon reporting. The SEC has reporting rules. California has a reporting rule. Like, everyone is going to be required at some point to file a report on their footprint. There's a common misconception that what gets measured gets managed. And it turns out, actually, the reason we're measuring it is because it's not getting managed. But if you're a large company, the question is not about measuring the footprint. It's about, what am I going to do about it?
Sure.
And I think a lot of folks have not inherently realized how expensive capital transformation is, but they also haven't rationalized how much money is already being spent on capital transformation, right? So when McKinsey comes out and says it's going to cost $200 trillion to get to net zero, a lot of that money is already being spent.
Sure.
When your car reaches the end of its life, you're already going to buy another car. It's not like someone who doesn't have a car and who commutes by bike is going to decide, well, I'm going to buy an EV to become more sustainable.
Right.
The bike is already way more sustainable than the EV. But that person who drives the gas-powered car, when that car reaches the end of life and buys an EV, they're making a capital decision. It's not an additional spend. It's spend that would have happened anyways.
Yep.
So I think a lot of people run into this roadblock of, oh my God, we'll never get sustainable because there's this additional cost. No, things break. They have lifetimes. They have to get replaced. Your diesel generator is going to run out of cycles in the next 5 to 15 years. Let's help you rationalize replacing that diesel generator with batteries, an electrolyzer, whatever it is. Let's help you rationalize the cleaner decision. It's not about capital spending increasing. It's about reallocating the capital from something that wasn't being done to something that is being done.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly, you've done a lot of work personally and published a lot on sustainability as a topic. I want to start with one aspect of your guys' mission statement and just get your take on that, which is you guys talk about the sustainability execution gap. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious for you to walk us through that, what it means, and how you at Actual are thinking about your contribution to closing that gap.
So this really comes from the fact that something like 90+% of global GDP has committed to net zero. Every big company says we're going to be net zero. Germany just announced that They want to be net negative by 2060, right? So we're going to go to 2050 and we'll hit zero. And then we're going to focus on carbon capture and things like that. And so we'll undo the impacts. That's very easy to say, but it's very expensive and very hard to do.
Yeah.
And that for us is that execution gap. As soon as people start thinking about the decisions they have to make, they get paralyzed. There are so many options and there's so much complexity. There's this movement that if we electrify everything, that we'll get to net zero. If you're an electric utility, it's easy to say, we're just going to move everything over. What is the order in which you're going to do that? For example, if you have a community that relies on gas for heating and you want to switch them from your gas side of your business to the electric side, that community is going to have a dramatic increase in how much electricity they're consuming. Do you have to go and build new generation and distribution capacity to support those heaters? Well, wait a minute. This community, only 30% of the homes are insulated. If we put insulation in the homes, suddenly they're not actually using that much more electricity because they heat the house and the warm air stays in. It's not escaping. Doing that across states and figuring out down to the neighborhood, where should we invest in insulation? Where should we invest in distribution generation?
Right.
Nothing about all the things that a company has to think about. A lot of these organizations, they have 20 or 30 internal roadmaps. So for that one CFO to say, I've got $3 billion to spend this year on CapEx, where do I spend it to have the impact? Very few executives we talk to now don't want to do something about climate. Very few executives don't want to do something about sustainability. They're getting hammered, not just from the outside, but in some new reports that most of the pressure is coming from the board to be more sustainable.
Right.
The problem is, which check do I sign? I've got 15 options. They're all over $100 million. I can pick 3 this year. How do I rationalize which 3? That's the execution gap.
Yeah. I suspect that, especially given your orientation towards the world, we've also got to look to the future to unproven things that are not yet out there to figure some of this stuff out. And so I'm curious, what are big innovations or fields of research that you're looking at, thinking, excited about, or that you think might become major contributors towards a more sustainable future?
Yeah, I think we have a tendency, especially in the US and definitely in Europe, to be very dogmatic about, is this allowed or not? And we've seen that with nuclear, for example. where countries that shut down nuclear have seen their emissions go up, or they're importing from dirtier places because they still need that load. I think nuclear is one of those things where we're starting to see new reactors come online. We're starting to see a shift where people are starting to realize, well, wait a minute, we do need that firm baseload power, and it needs to be clean. And what is the clean way of doing firm baseload? And I think what we're seeing is a lot of the dogma is actually shifting away when people get to execution, right? There's a lot of people who were very anti-solar and wind. And then they put a solar thing into their product and they're like, this works.
Yeah.
Like, I get it. The math, the science doesn't lie. Yeah. I think that for me is the biggest thing is if we really deploy renewables, we're going to have, in California already, we have an excess of renewables in the middle of the day. What do we do with that renewables? Are there uses we can make with it? There's also the tendency, I think, in a lot of the analytics to say, well, from an economics perspective, this thing makes the most sense versus that thing. But they're looking purely at the economics of the energy, not of the economics of the broader company around it.
Right.
So a lot of things that are very polarized today, I think what we'll see over the next few years, that polarization is starting to evaporate because as companies invest, costs come down, things become competitive. But also the people who are very dogmatic about the things, they're dogmatic because they're passionate. Because they're passionate, they're working on real projects. As they work on real projects, they start to be like, wait a minute, like I was very anti-X, but like it works.
Yeah.
And the flip side, we were all in on this technology. It's not panning out. I don't have time to waste on this anymore. Let's move on.
I mean, that's a good segue. In a world where there is still this polarization, these fights, and deeply entrenched, really emotional conversations, and we see the headlines that, you know, the week that we're recording, there's a bit of a scary headline on ocean temperatures, right? I'm curious how you stay hopeful and optimistic and continue investing your time, your money in these spaces and these technologies. How do you defeat the defeatism that can sometimes overwhelm us?
I think there's a couple of things. I think the first one is that as someone who's explicitly been working in closing the execution gap now for the better part of 5 years, I've seen the momentum build. I mean, just to be blunt, like 5 years ago, we were pitching VCs and they're saying climate is purely for philanthropy. There are going to be no climate companies that get VC funding. And we're just like, I think you're wrong.
Yeah.
So those people, by the way, now have climate-focused funds.
Yeah.
And so someone who had a conviction 5 years ago, this thing isn't real, has now gone to LPs and convinced those LPs that there is money to make in climate and that we should invest in climate.
Yep.
That's a huge shift. Right? That to me is a huge shift. That's number one. I think the second thing, when we think about climate impacts, we always look at emerging markets, developing countries, poorer countries, right? And we say, well, it's going to hit them the worst. When I talk to folks in these places, they're the ones who are moving the fastest, right? They're not having these endless debates about one technology versus another. Their focus is on, let me deploy a technology that's available today to improve lives and our economy. And so the other thing there is, yes, we're going to have to do adaptation. There's no way around that, right? But the other thing that gives me hope is that the countries that are going to be the most affected, as long as we, from an international policy perspective and a technology perspective, can continue to help them, not just philanthropically. We wrote a thing about this around like the loss and damage fund. We need to actually focus on bringing these countries into the broader ability to access capital to invest. There's a lot of demand to do that. There's a lot of demand to just build good infrastructure, to build resilience. And at that point, you know, we'll survive.
Big thanks to Karthik for joining us on the show today. I really loved diving in with him on some of the big and important topics in sustainability and entrepreneurship. I honestly could have spent another hour just picking his brain. I'm super fascinated by Actual and dying to get the chance to play around with the interface and see how it works. I think Karthik and his co-founders are tapping into something big with folks who grew up playing video games now entering business leadership roles. Gamifying decision-making could be a huge tool to unlock more impact. And I'm really excited to see how it all develops. If you want to learn more about Actual for yourself, or maybe even book a demo of their software, you can visit their website, actualhq.com, or connect with them on LinkedIn at actualhq. We'll have all this in the show notes for you. As for us, you can reach us by email at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. Or you can connect with me directly on LinkedIn or Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgone. Would love for you to reach out with any questions, comments, or ideas sparked by today's chat, or if you have a great suggestion for a future guest. We love getting your feedback and hearing from you, so if you're thinking about reaching out, you should definitely do it. Finally, if you liked the show today, please give us a follow, a like, and leave a review for us wherever you listen. This really helps us grow our reach and continue bringing you more awesome conversations with the business leaders that you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted and executive produced by me, Conor Gaughan. The episode was produced by Will Gatchell and Jeff Rock with editing from the good folks at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker, Greg Hergel on research, and Patrick Gallagher on strategy. Consensus in Conversation can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.